So topic 3, I was trying to recall exactly where we left off. I think we had talked about the stomach, and we were just about to talk about the small intestine. Can't quite remember what I said about the stomach, but I just wanted to emphasize that the stomach does have chemical and mechanical digestion, in that the stomach does grind food and mix it, and the final product you get in the stomach is something called chyme, and that's basically your food that's ground and mixed with these digestive chemicals. It doesn't really look anything like food anymore at this point. And in many cases, the fat hasn't really solubilized with the chyme, and so it sort of becomes a separate mass of its own. In terms of what is in the stomach, I think I talked about this, but kind of 3 main secretions. One is mucus, and the mucus protects the stomach cells from the acid in the stomach. The stomach cells, of course, would be digested and destroyed themselves because if that mucus wasn't there. And in fact, they do kind of get replaced. I think it's like every 3 to 6 days or something like that. The stomach cells actually do replace themselves. It is a pretty volatile environment. The other 2 things are hydrochloric acid, which makes the stomach very acidic, and an enzyme called pepsin. So if you think about what's going on here, the stomach is not doing a lot in terms of digestion. It's a little bit more mixing and getting things into that chyme form. With the one exception, the pepsin. The pepsin is actually what we call a protease. That's a type of enzyme that starts to break down proteins. So at this point, you're not breaking down proteins into amino acids, but just into smaller little bits, so that things are ready for the small intestine. In the small intestine, this is where the digestion happens, at least kind of 90-something% of the digestion. And this is a cross section of the small intestine. Had a really hard time finding a really nice cross section image, and this one I liked the most because you can see kind of all the features here in one spot. So first on the left, you can see the intestine is just really just a long tube. Depending on how big you are as a person, it's about 8 or 9 meters. So think about that, right? Like 8 or 9 meters is pretty long if you want to stretch that out. Your typical automobile, depending whether it's a car or a minivan, could be 3 to 4 meters long. And so that's a lot of length. And this gives us an opportunity to try to get as much out of the food as possible, and many nutrients. And some of the other features that help us get the nutrients is you can see that the intestine, you can see it shown right here, has these villi, which is these little folds, right? And those folds increase the surface area of the intestine so that there's more opportunities for absorption. And if you zoom in on the villi, here's a zoom in here, the villi actually have microvilli, so little folds within the folds. And that was something we pointed out last lecture when I showed you the image of the cell. I said, hey, there's some microvilli on this cell. We'll talk about those when we get to the intestine. So here we are. Like I said, really the whole idea is to increase that surface area so that we can maximize our absorption, of course. The other thing that I wanted to point out that I do like about this particular image is it shows the blood vessels. And that's obviously important because this is what the intestine is trying to do, is have nutrients get absorbed and get into the blood so that they can feed the body. And so that's a big part of it. I'm just going to skip to the next slide for a second here. Hold on a second. Just trying to see where I am. I know I want to talk about microbes. We'll come back to that in a minute. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we could say about the small intestine. It's supported by a whole bunch of other organs. And I think I meant to have some slides on each of these, but I know they're in the notes. I just don't seem to have the slides. I guess I forgot to do so. But it's supported by really 3 other organs that secrete stuff. One is the pancreas. And the pancreas is kind of like, in some ways, I'm not going to say it's the most important, but again, it's a very multifunctional digestive gland. It secretes a whole bunch of stuff, and we often call it pancreatic juice. And the pancreatic juice includes enzymes for breaking down things. So more proteases for breaking down proteins, lipases for breaking down lipids, glycosylases for breaking down carbohydrates, So those are kind of the main food groups. But there's also enzymes that break down nucleic acids, such as DNA, which is part of your food, right? When you're eating food, you're eating DNA. It's just very, very tiny. It's like, I think 1% of the entire food mass. So it's not really considered a major source of nutrition, but we can break them down and we can use those nucleic acids to make our own DNA and RNA and things like that. So the pancreatic juice has enzymes. That's a big one, obviously. Another big one is something called sodium bicarbonate. So basically baking soda. So why is our pancreas secreting baking soda? Well, it's coming from the stomach. The stomach is all acid. And so this is actually neutralizing the acid. Some of you at home may have made a volcano or something as a project, and you're adding the baking soda to the vinegar, and vinegar is an acid, and you know that they react and neutralize each other. And of course, the fun thing is that's making bubbles. And this is actually one source of some of our intestinal gas. There's always a little bit of it. And some people have more than others, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. So pancreas secreting three things: enzymes, sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, and hormones, right? Hormones that we're going to talk about over the next few units. Hormones that regulate blood sugar levels and things like that. So the pancreas secretes insulin and glucagon, which are two hormones we're going to talk a lot about over the next few units. So the small intestine is supported by the pancreas. That's good. Also supported by the liver. The liver, like I said, has so many functions, it's kind of hard to keep track of them all. But it secretes something called bile. So bile is something, I don't know, even the name just kind of sounds gross. But what is bile? Bile is a compound. Its chemistry in some ways is kind of similar to detergents or soaps in that it breaks up fat. And that's the whole idea, is to break up fat globules into smaller globules or droplets, and then the lipids can be digested a little bit easier. And so the liver actually puts the bile into the gallbladder, and the gallbladder is the last organ that supports the small intestine, and the gallbladder is what actually secretes it into the small intestine. So like I said, from this image here, you can't see obviously the pancreas or the liver or the gallbladder, but you can see the blood vessels for the food absorption, and the food is going to end up in the blood. The fats often end up in the lymph, and but not everything gets digested, right? Not all the water gets absorbed here, and anything that's fiber. We're going to talk a lot about fiber next lecture. Fiber is the indigestible parts of plants. And it's good for you though, even if it's not digestible. That's kind of what we're gonna get into. And minerals and vitamins and those kind of things, some of them get absorbed and some of them don't. It kind of depends on how much is in there. And the nutrient state of and the health of your body, of course, because some people are pretty good at absorbing nutrients more than others. And some of that just depends on your health state or your starvation state and things like that as well. So that's kind of the intestine. The big one to take away is it's a big part of the digestion. Like I said, this is where most of our nutrients get broken down. And then some of those supportive things, if we think about, and we'll talk about carbohydrates and lipids and proteins in later units, and we'll talk a little bit more about their digestion in terms of how that works. As hinted here, I want to talk a little bit about microorganisms again, and I can't remember what I said before about the probiotics, but our body is, you can think of it, our body is like an ecosystem. And so here's some numbers for you, by the way. So we have about 30 trillion human cells on our body. And if we take a look at the microorganisms, we probably have at least the same amount. I know there's some sources that say 10 times more, and I think that's kind of, it's not accurate compared to some of the newer studies done, but either way, we're looking at trillions of bacterial cells. So what are they doing to our body? And so we're starting to think about the human body as not just all human cells, and because we really are a complete ecosystem where we're going to have relationships with these organisms, and And you got to realize that many of these relationships are not bad. When people first had a link between microorganisms and disease, the idea is we got to kill all these things. But it turns out that many of them are good and they're living in symbiosis with us. In fact, we'd be less healthy without them. Some more numbers for you. We also have, we don't just have bacteria in our gut. We have viruses, we have fungi, we have archaea, we have protists. We even have animals that live in us and on us. If you want to be grossed out, look up eyelash mite. That's something that creeps a lot of people out. We're all going to get them if you don't have them yet. So the terms we use to describe these microbes that live in us and on us, there's a few different terms. The oldest term that people used to use was flora or microflora. Flora often means flowers and plants, so this is why we say microflora. And if you look back a couple hundred years ago, people were thinking that bacteria were plants because they had cell walls, but they're not plants. So this newer term was coined maybe 20 years ago, microbiota. I kind of don't like it. It's not as descriptive. But the term that everybody is using nowadays is this one here, microbiome. And if you Google microbiome, you're going to see thousands of web pages on the microbiome and what you can do to help the microbiome, help your health and those kind of things. But from a technical level, it's really just referring to the populations of microorganisms that are living in and on your body, of which most of them, by the way, are in your digestive tract. And I alluded to this before. I had mentioned that the microbes in your digestive tract are making serotonin. So they're making neurotransmitters. They're helping you to digest food. Some of them are making vitamin K for you. So there's a lot of good things going on, and some of them we don't really understand. Why are they making serotonin? Why are they making a human neurotransmitter? And those kind of things. And so there's all sorts of people interested in them now and trying to tease out the health effects of having a healthy microbiome. You can see at the bottom here, I have a list of various diseases that the microbiome is connected to, including allergic diseases, all sorts of digestive kind of disorders, brain diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. The health of your microbiome can actually affect how well you respond to other drugs. So I was reading a study about looking at cancer patients who were undergoing chemotherapy, and they looked and they could actually predict how well the cancer patient would respond to the chemotherapy by surveying their microbiome. So in that case, it meant they were looking at their poop, because that's where most of the microbes are in the gut. There's so much that is not understood about this. But this is where the probiotics are capitalizing on, because they're trying to say, hey, we're going to make your microbiome healthier. One other thing I would like to say about the microbiome is that I'm starting to see sometimes people calling it the second brain, right? People are starting to think about it really as an organ, and calling it a brain is like kind of crazy. So what are they talking about there? And like I said, you have these microorganisms that are making neurotransmitters. And so it seems that a healthy microbiome can actually be correlated with healthy mental health, which is kind of like wild, right? I mean, when we think about mental health, you think about all these other things, such as alcoholism, or how people are treating you, or, the circumstances. We're all probably suffering a little bit of mental health from going through this pandemic, right? Those kind of things. But to think that what is inside your gut can be affecting your brain is it's gaining a lot of traction. We're going to come back to these guys a few times, but the last thing I'll say about this is probably one of the best things we understand about the microbiome is that diversity is good. And this is one reason why eating fiber is good for us, because it encourages diversity in our intestinal tract of those microorganisms. People that have diets high on processed and high sugar, high fats foods, their microbiome complement is a lot less rich. And so this may, again, it's these chicken or the eggs kind of things, right? In terms of, trying to understand which came first in terms of, did the healthy microbiome come first, or did that promote the unhealthy eating habits? And so there's a lot that needs to be teased out, but lots of people, like I said, excited about microbiomes. You can take a look at the literature on this kind of thing, and there's literally probably at least 1,000 different species of bacteria in your gut. Some good, some bad. The ones we are trying to get rid of are the ones that cause disease. You can see there's a few mentioned down there. Campylobacter, for example. Sometimes we associate that with food sickness or food poisoning. Causes diarrhea and cramps and those kind of things, and not fun to have. But I do want to point out E. coli here. So E. coli is up here in the list of good organisms, and that just warms my heart because I love E. coli. I've done lots of research on E. coli, and it's always getting a bad rap in the news. And there are some bad versions of E. coli that can cause travelers diarrhea and things like that. But for the most part, it's good. Notice it says here it's making vitamin K2 for you, and it's keeping some bad bacteria in check. So it actually is a good organism. But like I said, there's thousands of them. E. coli is just a small proportion of that. So like I said, don't be surprised if I come back and talk about this a lot more, because I love microorganisms. Another thing I want to say about this, like I said, this whole idea, which came first, the chicken or the egg, there's a lot of debate around this with these microorganisms in our gut. And there's one famous study here done. This was actually done quite a few years ago. I'm trying to think of it's more than 10 years ago now, where they were looking at this idea because they started to realize when you look at obese people versus people who are slim, there tends to be a bit of a different profile in the microorganisms in their gut. And so they're like, are these microorganisms causing that person to be slim or overweight? Is kind of one of the questions. And so what they did is they took some notabiotic mice, which means they're germ-free mice. They were grown born in a germ-free environment, and so they were not able to get their own guts colonized after being born. And they basically gave them samples of the microbes from two people's guts, right? One person who was overweight and one person who was slim. And they found that the mouse that received the microorganisms from the obese person, it overate. It didn't seem to have control over its appetite, and it ended up being an obese mouse. So this is a big question now, right? Are microorganisms causing us to have these kind of things happen to our bodies? I'll just say this was quite a few years ago now, and there's been a number of follow-up studies, and I don't think we're closer to getting answers. It does seem there's a relationship between the microorganisms and things like being able to control our appetite, and certain microorganisms help to release nutrients more, so you may be able to absorb fat better if you have certain microbes and things like that. But there's still a question as to whether those microbes are causing it, or whether you get those microbes because you've already had, let's say, bad habits. You're eating a lot of fast food and things like that. But maybe someday in the future we'll be able to tease this out a little bit more and have better, let's say, versions of probiotics or whatnot. But honestly, again, the biggest recommendation is people need to eat fruits and vegetables and lots of fiber, because that encourages a good microbe gut profile. It's just, fiber is apparently, even though we can't digest it, it's just an amazing product. And we'll talk a little bit more about fiber, hopefully on Friday. We're going to start talking about carbohydrates, and fiber fits into that category. But anyway, like I said, this stuff really fascinates me, and I keep reading more and more, and we're starting to get some answers. It just takes a lot of time with science like this, where it's very, very, very complex. Okay, so moving on, just looking at my notes here, and there are a couple other things I want to say about the microbiome that I didn't touch on here. One is that like I said, there's a whole bunch of research on this, and when you look into it, it's super fascinating. But one of the things I want to point out about the microbiome is that it's actually essential for proper development of your immune system. They've studied this in mice. Like I said, you can make these germ-free mice, and then a normal mouse, and the mouse that's been colonized by bacteria has a much more healthy immune system. So we know there's a huge connection between your gut microbes, and we think we even know which ones, and the development of a proper immune system as a child. The other thing I think I hinted on was that some of these microbes will help with digesting food and even breaking down certain types of fibers that will actually help you digest them a little bit. Not a huge amount, and of course they're producing hormones and neurotransmitters. But like I said, the relationship between obesity and those kind of things is sort of, we're still trying to understand it. I think that some people think they understand it, but from what I've read in the literature, we're still trying to really get a full understanding. And really the recommendation is eat that fiber and get that exercise. That's kind of the best thing you can do about your gut microbiome. Okay, so moving on, I want to move on to the large intestine, which is also called the colon. And at this point, for the most part, we've digested, our digestion and absorption is kind of complete. Not 100%, but kind of getting there. The colon is really just for primarily reabsorbing a lot of the water, because what you have now entering the colon is still quite moist, and we want to get some of that water back. So we do that in the colon. Some minerals are dissolved here. Minerals don't usually require special digestive enzymes or anything like that. They're just going to pass through the wall of the intestine. And so at this point here, anything that's undigested is going to start to form the fecal matter, right? And this is a place where fiber is particularly important, because fiber, it does two things, right? It gives some bulk or quantity to the fecal matter, and also actually absorbs a little bit of moisture and can make your fecal matter a little softer, right? No one wants a big, hard, crusty, right? And this is something that feces or fiber can help with, right? So that's kind of another area where we talk about fiber as being quite important. And eventually it comes out the rectum, and hopefully that's the end of it that we see anyway. So a few more things about digestive processes in terms of how long it takes, 1 to 2 days, kind of from start to finish. Depends on what it is. Some things will get into your system really quickly and are absorbed really quickly, like simple sugars. Alcohol can get into your system within a minute on an empty stomach kind of thing. Other things, are going to take a little bit of time. Protein in particular tends to take a little bit longer, for example, than carbohydrates and so on. And you can see there's some kind of average transit times. So 24 to 48 hours is pretty typical. There's a lot of quirks and whatever you want to call them from the digestive tract. Not going to go into all of these, and there's lots of treatments and things like that I'm not going to go into, because I'm not so familiar with all of the recommendations necessarily, but you may have heard of some of these things. Hiccups and choking are often people eating too fast, maybe not chewing properly, those kind of things, and you get food and air trapped in weird places. Sometimes eating too much, people get heartburn, which is no fun, and in many cases there's good solutions and long and kind of longer term solutions, right? But often it's people need to eat in the right amount and at the right rate, and those kind of things will solve a lot of things. There's other digestive disturbances, including gas, ulcers, constipation, diarrhea. They all have, with the exception of ulcers, have multiple causes. Gas is trapped gas, right? And some of that is just gas in that, let's say you chew a piece of bread. There's air that can be trapped in that bread as you swallow it, right? So sometimes we take in a certain amount of gases from the atmosphere. Some of the gases are produced by microorganisms. Hydrogen and methane gases are kind of two of the big ones. And, you know, sometimes that has to do with our diet or microorganisms and things like that. I think I've got a slide about gas. I'll talk about it in a minute. Constipation, diarrhea, again, multiple causes, some infectious, some diet-wise, some have to do with other diseases. And I mean, we could spend an entire lecture on all of these things, but we are going to move on. Yes, I do have a little thing here on foods and intestinal gas, and it talks about certain foods. And again, this is something that can be very person specific. For some people, it's milk. Milk is a big one, particularly people who have a hard time with the lactose. They get digestive discomfort. One of the issues is gas, right? Which you know, if it builds up enough, it can cause some serious discomfort in there. Beans are apparently famous, and certain vegetables, and you can see that unfortunately, some gas-promoting foods are the ones that we should be eating. Certain fruits and vegetables. Some people who eat too much fiber are getting, unfortunately, a little too much gas. So you know, it's one of those things. If you do have a problem, you can experiment a little bit. For some people, it's pretty easy. They cut out the dairy. I think there's ways to deal with beans. I don't know, washing them or something like that. I've heard. I don't really know a lot about it, quite honestly. But you know, if this is something that is a problem for you, maybe worth talking to your doctor about as well. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about storage systems, and then we're going to transition and talk about alcohol. So what do I mean by storage systems? I mean, what do we do with this food, right? We're not using it all immediately, right? If we used all our food immediately, then we would have to be constantly eating and intaking all the right things. So our body can take these nutrients and it can store them, right? So two of the biggest energy providing nutrients are, of course, carbohydrates and fat. And carbohydrates can get stored in two main places, the liver and the muscles. It gets stored in the form of something called glycogen. We're going to talk about glycogen in more detail when we get to our carbohydrate unit on Friday. Glycogen is a source of glucose. And our cells, that's kind of one of the main energy sources for our cells. In fact, that's the only energy source our brain can use. Our brain can only use glucose. It's the only thing it can use. So that's very important that we have a readily available store of glucose for our brain, which is partly why it's stored in the liver. The muscles, obviously, the muscles are one of the biggest energy users in the body. So having the glycogen stored directly in the muscles kind of makes sense, right? It's like having your gasoline already in your car, as opposed to you know, filling it up every single time you need to go for a drive. It's already full. You only need to fill it up once in a while. Fat cells are all over the body, and that's where we can store fat. And of course, if you eat too much of any of the other nutrients, our body is ready and willing to convert it all into fat. Right? That's the bad news. And the other bad news is our bodies, they have kind of a limited capacity to store glycogen in the liver and muscles. You can increase that capacity with working out and, you know, growing bigger muscles and those kind of things. But there's a limit, right? And training, athletic training can help that kind of thing. Whereas our fat cells, they probably have, it seems they have somewhat of an unlimited capacity. This is why you can get some very, very large humans, because in theory, you eat these calories and our body will store it in those fat tissues, which is really, not fun for some of us, right? You know, just wanted to point out this diagram here. There are a couple of things. What do I do with my pen here? I just lost my pen. I don't know what I did with it. Oh, here it is. So the other thing on here that's not in my text is proteins, right? Proteins get broken down into amino acids, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on when we talk about proteins. But you can see one of the things that's, you know, protein technically is energy storage, and we're not usually storing protein energy to be used later. with the exception of this here, right? When we're starving. And this is where our body is going to start cannibalizing our muscle tissue because, you know, we don't have any other choice, which is unfortunate. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the semester. You can see this is showing some of the breakdowns of some of these things, and we'll talk about some of these things later. Like you can see glycogen being broken down into glucose. Lipids can get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol and things like that. And again, we'll get into a little bit of that in more detail with the other units. Want to throw down a definition for you. You may have heard of this. This definition is sometimes we'll talk about adipose tissue, and that really is fat tissue, right? I don't know why we have to have a special name for it, but welcome to the English language where we like to have, you know, 5 words for everything. Anyway, yeah, that's just another term for fat storage. Really, is these adipose cells. This diagram here is just showing when we eat all of these other things, we eat them in excess, they can get stored as fat. So fun, fun, fun. What about the other things, right? Vitamins and minerals. Kind of depends on what they are, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these when we talk about vitamins and minerals on that unit. Some of them I'll say can be stored in pretty high quantities, and unfortunately, in some cases, they can reach toxic levels. Others don't seem to reach toxic levels. Some are excreted immediately. You know, you consume excess vitamin C, for example, and for the most part, it gets excreted in your urine. Vitamin D, on the other hand, we can store that in our liver, and we can actually get it to toxic levels, and it can start calcifying liver tissue and I think in the kidneys as well, if I remember correctly, which can be a big deal, right? So we do want to make sure we're not exceeding our stores of these things. So a little bit more on these type of things later. I thought I had another note to say about these, but I don't see my note handy at the moment. So I guess that's it for our storage systems. Okay, so I was hoping to have a Kahoot here, but unfortunately, my week has been super busy, so I have not been able to catch up with a number of things. But the good news is today's lecture will probably be a little shorter. So at least that gives you a bit more time if you're still working on your assignment and whatnot. So we'll talk about the assignments here in a moment when I get to the end of today's lecture. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about alcohol, and I actually have a short 2-minute video for you as well, which kind of breaks up me talking. There's so much we could say about alcohol, you know, and I had a hard time actually preparing for this part of the lecture because there's just this amazing amount of information for it. You could talk about the alcohol effects on mental health, and you could talk about this system and your kidneys and your liver and your brain, and it's a little hard to get into, and you know, unfortunately, a lot of it's bad news. It's not all bad news, but it's something definitely to consider, and it's one of those things when you learn enough about alcohol, you know, you start to get to a point where it's like, why do we even consume this stuff? But anyway, let's talk a little bit about alcohol. Like I said, it's not all bad news, and you don't have to quit if you like to consume it, but moderation is one of the biggest keys here when talking about alcohol. So one thing to tell you about alcohol is when we're talking about alcohol from a chemistry standpoint, we're looking at chemicals that have this, an OH. From a dietary standpoint, we're looking at this molecule and this one alone. There's a whole bunch of alcohols out there. You may have heard of butanol or propanol, whole bunch of them out there, and I hope that you never drink any of those. Or methanol. Methanol will kill you or make you blind. So do not go there. Even rubbing alcohols, isopropanol, you don't want to drink that. So we're talking about a lot of toxic compounds. So ethanol technically is a toxin. This one here is probably the mildest of all of them. And the good news is our bodies actually have mechanisms for dealing with it. And so this is why we can consume it, at least in moderate quantities. And we can have, you know, in moderate quantities, you know what, it's not bad, right? There's actually some positive effects. You know, it is a depressant. It'll slow your body down a little bit. But in low doses, you're looking at things like euphoria, maybe reduced anxiety. You're a little bit more sociable, maybe a little more relaxed. And of course, there's all sorts of cultural and celebratory reasons why alcohol may be a good thing. You pop a bottle of champagne to celebrate something. You're enjoying the soccer game on the television with your friends, and you're having a beer to celebrate your team or something like that, right? I mean, not a big deal. It's the higher doses where we get a lot more concerned. Obviously, there's drunkenness and stupor, and in some cases, people get alcohol poisoning, which can lead to death. Long-term use is even the worst area of alcohol consumption, and all sorts of disorders associated with it. And we'll talk about some of those here. What I wanted to show you is just in terms of, myself, with my microbiology background, I think a lot about alcohols as chemicals, and many alcohols are used to denature membranes, it turns out. So this is kind of a little diagram showing a membrane and how alcohol, ethanol can kind of get in there and disrupt the lipids of your membrane. And it will do a little bit of this to your nerves, which is why, you're getting slowed down, and some of your judgment is impaired in terms of biologically what's going on. But this has actually, you probably have seen alcohol all over the planet now. People are using hand sanitizers everywhere, and some brands of hand sanitizers are made out of ethanol. In fact, a good majority of them are. You can see here's Purell. They've been making a killing the last couple of years, and 65%, sometimes 70% ethanol. So don't drink your Purell, please. There's usually other stuff in there that you may not want to drink. Sometimes there's aloe vera, which is, I guess maybe you could consume that, but there's often agents that will make it jellified or give it a scent. And often the hand sanitizer ethanols have contaminants in there, like methanol. So you don't want to be drinking them, just in case anybody who was considering drinking their hand sanitizer, which I'm sure none of you were. But just so you know, it's the same ethanol though, right? And some hand sanitizers and alcohol swabs actually have isopropanol in them, and kind of the same idea, right? And this is effective against a lot of microorganisms. It's effective against coronaviruses. Coronaviruses actually have a membrane around them. It's not effective against some other viruses like norovirus. You may have heard of that, causes vomiting and diarrhea, often burns through daycares and nursing homes and hospitals once in a while. It does not have a membrane around it. So it kind of depends on the organism, but is effective against coronaviruses if used properly. Although honestly, hand washing is always the gold standard, good hand washing. I shouldn't have to tell you this, but it seems like people don't know that. Some people don't wash their hands well enough. And it is really good for your health, and it's good to protect everyone else's health. So here's some numbers. I was looking to get some numbers, and I found a few for you in terms of alcohol consumption, and some of it is kind of interesting. So this is $2.16 billion are spent per month in Canada on beer, wine, and liquor. So I divided that by 37 million, or whatever the population of Canada is. That's about $57 per Canadian. So maybe that doesn't sound so bad. It's a big industry, but this does not include all the alcohol consumed, because of course some people make their own wine and whatnot. So this is the actual number, the amount is consumed. So 8.1 liters. So this is the amount of pure alcohol consumed annually per Canadian over the age of 15. So that's kind of equivalent to about 475 bottles of beer or 90 bottles of wine. So that sounds like a lot. In terms of the actual quantity, we're looking at about 100 liters of alcohol per year. And so that's kind of boggling my mind, because I'm like, wow, that's a big volume. But I don't know. I mean, I guess 100 liters, that's, divided by 52 weeks, that's, I guess 2 liters a week. That's kind of like maybe 4 beer. So maybe that's not too bad. I don't know. I mean, you can be the judge on that one. Beer is the most popular drink in Canada, although it's down. It turns out that 10 years ago, beer was around 43%. Now it's at 38%. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. I'm not sure, it's probably being replaced by wine and maybe a few other drinks. It seems there's a lot more wineries and interesting wines out there as well. Apparently there's 4 breweries in Canada per 100,000 adults, and that's up from 10 years ago. And you can certainly see that, all these little microbreweries popping up all over the place and making some interesting products. So the other question I had, there's a whole bunch of numbers floating out there trying to talk about alcohol consumption in the pandemic. And so Stats Canada, I figured, was probably the most reliable on this kind of thing, because a lot of them were informal sort of surveys. And the answer is yes, that consumption is up, but not by everybody. Maybe about a quarter of Canadians have increased consumption, and maybe a quarter, a similar amount, have decreased consumption. And it has gone in waves too, right? You know, at the beginning of the first lockdown, consumption skyrocketed, for example. And if you look at the reasons why people are drinking more, it makes sense. People are bored, or it's convenient. They're now working at home, so maybe they're having a beer with lunch that you wouldn't be doing that at work. Those kind of things. Loneliness, that's a big one during the pandemic. People, and then for other people, the exact opposite. So anyway, I thought this was kind of interesting because, of course, I think everyone just assumes consumption has gone up, but that's not the case for everyone. I saw another study that said 35% of people have actually reduced consumption of alcohol. It didn't say the reasons why, but it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, if you're maybe you're not making as much money, and so that's an expense, or you just making that trip to the store. You're not driving by the liquor store on the way home from work because you're working at home. I mean, there could be all sorts of reasons for that, or health. Some people stop drinking for health reasons and whatnot. I saw this little article done by the University of Victoria, and they were focusing on alcohol consumption in British Columbia. But you can see the yellow line. So this one here is all of Canada. And they were making, if you go and read the article, it's kind of interesting. They make a lot of points about, the consumption of alcohol is actually linked to the economy. And you see this as you have recessions and things like that. Consumption kind of ebbs and flows. And just like almost everything in the economy, it ebbs and flows. And there's lots of reasons why, trends change and whatnot. But anyway, I thought it was interesting. They were saying that consumption of alcohol was up for British Columbians, but that overall consumption of alcohol is actually down a little bit for overall Canadians in the last few years. So not sure what those trends mean. Have to get a sociologist for that. So let's talk a little bit about alcohol in the body. I'm going to play this video for you, and they make some good points in there, and probably touch on some of them over the next few minutes. So play this for you, nice and short. I was looking for a good video on this, and there's a lot of great ones I could find, but they were like 12, 15 minutes long. I was just looking for something that kind of was short and sweet is what I was looking for. So I will play this for you if I can get it to play. Come on. I may have to just go to the link. So hold on a second. I am going to have to change my screen share. There we go. All right, I think you two should be on your screen now. I'll just make this full screen and then.
We explain what alcohol does to your body. This is Michael. He enjoys going out and drinking at the weekend, sometimes a bit more than he should. He's worried that it might be affecting his health. What exactly is alcohol doing to him? Michael knows that alcohol is used to describe beverages containing ethanol. Depending on their amount and volume percentage, some drinks are stronger than others. The intoxicating effects of alcohol are caused by ethanol entering the bloodstream faster than the liver can break it down, thus changing the signals sent from the brain to other parts of the body. This causes the euphoric and relaxed experience of being drunk, but it also has its risks. Lower doses of alcohol cause Michael to lose his sense of balance and ability to make decisions. He might even be sick because alcohol can irritate the stomach and have a negative effect on the inner ear. Higher doses of alcohol are far more dangerous, particularly if consumed regularly, because areas of the brain responsible for breathing, heart rate, and temperature control begin to shut down. Long-term problems can include addiction, liver disease, high blood pressure, and cancer. Alcohol's effect upon the central nervous system can lead to coma and even death. To minimize damage to health and society, each country has its own laws on alcohol, including the amount Michael can drink before driving a vehicle on the road. They may also have guidelines for how much alcohol is safe to drink each day. Michael is glad that he now knows the dangers of alcohol and how it affects his body. So, if you consume alcohol, drink responsibly.
Okay, so like I said, kind of short and sweet. Like I said, any of these areas we could expand on and go on forever. We could probably spend hours on just alcohol in the brain, for example. But we're not going to. Just kind of want to touch on each of these things just a little bit here. One thing I wanted to say was, in terms of trying to understand what is safe and healthy and all those kind of things is part of the debate. But there's recommendations. This is from what's the group called? Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction. And these are kind of internationally recognized standards as well. And they have these nice graphics. So I figured it was a good place to share. I know the textbook talks about what is a drink, and it's got sort of a really ugly picture. So this one, at least the infographic, is a little nicer. But talking about, what is kind of recommended safe drinking guidelines. And so worth it to touch on this a little bit. You can see their definition of what is a drink in terms of, basically one beer or cider or cooler, a glass of wine, which is not full. 142 milliliters is not even one measuring cup worth. And then, of course, you got more concentrated alcohol. So the one thing to keep in mind is that different beverages have different amounts of alcohol in it, right? So that's something to consider when you're choosing your drinks. And one beer, right? Like sometimes a can of beer is smallish, sometimes it's bigger. You've got these big tall ones. And so another thing to consider, and of course, some are light beers versus some are more concentrated. I remember having one a couple of years ago, and it was quite honestly awful. And I looked at it, and it was 12% alcohol, which is equivalent to wine. I was like, what are they doing to this thing? Somebody must like it because it was in the store. But it is what it is, right? So when they're talking about these guidelines, this is what they're talking about. And like I said, these are pretty much internationally understood kind of standards. And so you can see the measurements there. And if you're not sure what, 341 mils looks like or 12 ounces, this is the kind of thing when you take your drink, start taking a look at that can and how many mils is this? And it's really not that hard to figure out once you get a little bit of practice of reading bottles and things like that. So what are they recommending? They're recommending for women to limit it to 2 drinks a day and men 3 drinks a day. So notice that, so that's 10 drinks a week for women. And you're thinking, wait a second, 2 times 7 is 14. So they're also recommending that you don't drink every day. Hopefully that, makes sense there. And they're saying on special occasions, no more than 3 drinks for women or 4 for men. And we'll talk about why men and women are different. Obviously, in kind of on average, there's usually a bit of a size difference, but in terms of metabolism, men really can handle alcohol a lot more. And I'll explain why that is in a minute. Some of the other recommendations is that you don't drink at all during certain circumstances, like when you're driving a vehicle or doing driving anything, or dealing with dangerous tools or some other physically dangerous activity. So hopefully all that makes sense, right? And obviously some medications interact with alcohols, and so that's when it needs to be avoided. And there's a lot of health conditions where drinking alcohol may be detrimental. A big one, and they actually have a special section for it, of course, is not drinking when you are pregnant or planning to be pregnant. And we'll touch on that here on the next slide. I think I've got a little box for that. And so pregnant 0 is safest. Alcohol is absorbed by the body almost immediately, and it gets into the blood and can go directly to the fetus. And we'll talk a little bit more in a later unit on alcohol fetal syndrome, which is the effect of alcohol on the fetus. We'll get to that in a later unit. But the recommendation right now is that 0, which is obviously pretty safe way to do it, I suppose. The other big recommendation, and if you have kids or if you're having kids someday, one of those, just a little parenting tip, it's always good to talk to your kids about some of these things, right? And of course, people do, as teenagers, for example, they may be interested in experimenting a little bit. But in terms of brain development, it's best to encourage your kids to wait as long as possible, particularly binge drinking and things like that, because alcohol can have a huge effect on developing brains. And so, there's some recommendations in this. You can download the document if you go to that link at the bottom. And it talks a little bit more about teens and some of the effects and whatnot. So, again, I could probably spend an entire lecture on teen drinking and whatnot, but we only have so much time this semester, unfortunately. And then other tips, right? You can see a whole bunch of them there. We'll talk about a little bit, about drinking slowly and not doing it on an empty stomach and things like that. And of course, everyone is going to have different limits, right? We shouldn't be surprised that two people that seem to be the same weight and gender and those kind of things, and one person, is feeling tipsy after one drink, and the other person, is down in 4 or 5 and whatnot. Obviously, everybody's body is different, which is why these are sort of, they're guidelines, right? They're not hard and fast rules, but they are trying to use some of the best data out there. Another thing too that is talked about a lot in the literature on alcohol consumption is, of course, heavy drinking, right? And this is some information from Stats Canada, and according to this, according to Stats Canada, about 20% of men in Canada are what we consider heavy drinkers, which is not a really solid definition, but they say having 5 or more drinks for men, or women having 4 or more drinks on one occasion at least once a month. So that's more than the exceeded guideline, right? Remember, the guideline was 3 for men, 4 max on any one occasion. So it's kind of fitting that strategy. You can see that there's some different profiles based on age group as well. Again, I'm not going to go into all of this stuff here about behaviors on moderate drinkers and problem drinkers and things like that. But you can see some of the behaviors, and I'm sure many of us have seen this kind of behavior in different people. And I'm not going to get into and talk a lot about alcoholism in this class. Maybe touch on it here or there. But many of us have been affected by it either personally, or knowing someone personally, kind of thing, that has had this. Myself, I've had a number of alcoholics in the family, and it is unfortunate kind of thing that happens. I do want to point out a couple of things here, though, and we'll talk about that in a moment. For example, eating food or drinking on an empty stomach. That is one of the big recommendations, around drinking and trying to, do a better job of it anyway. But anyway, enough on this here. Not trying to make a sermon or anything like that. Let's talk a little bit about alcohol in the body. Like I said, I could really get into tons of detail on this because it really does affect every system, and so it's kind of hard to just limit myself, unfortunately, on this. But I've said this before already. Alcohol will enter your body rapidly. It doesn't even have to get to the intestine. It can actually get into the blood through the stomach wall. So that's kind of crazy to think about that. So this is why eating is kind of recommended, that you have some food in your stomach, and that will kind of, the food is going to mix with the alcohol and kind of slow down the absorption of it, right? Help with that, right? Whereas drinking on an empty stomach, all that alcohol can get absorbed very quickly and reach the brain and other body systems, and of course, impair the person. When a person starts eating, like alcohol, technically, like I said, is a toxin. And consuming enough of it quite rapidly can induce vomiting. And of course, many people have had that kind of effect with drinking too much. You probably know that alcohol is a diuretic. If you've drunk too much, you have to pee a lot, and so that's part of it as well. So one of the recommendations as well is for every drink a person has is they drink a non-alcoholic beverage. So maybe a glass of water or some fruit juice or something like that to kind of help the body with this kind of effect, right? When alcohol hits the brain, this is where we see a lot of the visible effects, of course. And so the brain, of course, is for our thinking. And what it does is apparently it kind of reaches this area pretty quickly. And this is the area that kind of, there's a lot of thinking and reasoning. So this is why, someone who's drunk too much alcohol, we're kind of, it's interfering with your reasoning and your judgment, right? Suddenly something that didn't seem like a good idea when you were sober, suddenly seems like a much better idea when you've been drinking, right? And then, prolonged effect, you're starting to look at, other effects on the brain. So things like speech gets slurred, and vision and reasoning becomes even more incapacitated. All those kind of things get affected, and then eventually it starts to affect other parts of their brain, right? Where someone literally is going to stagger and lose some muscle control and things like that. But basically, when this part of the brain is affected to a certain degree, person often loses consciousness. So they pass out, which is actually a really good thing, because if that person was going to drink more, it's going to kill them, right? So this is a good thing that people do pass out, and then the problem is some people, they binge drink, or they drink really quickly, and this is where alcohol poisoning can come in, which is basically when the alcohol is starting to affect your autonomic functions, such as your breathing and your heart rate, and so that can lead to death, right? Which is why the passing out is maybe the preferred alternative. And but anyway, like I said, could go on about this for quite some time, but hopefully you get the idea. And there's some notes there kind of about some of the stuff I said. So another thing that probably a lot of people know a little bit about is that alcohol affects the liver. So it's worth to talk a little about what's going on in the liver. So if you remember, when alcohol reaches the intestines, the blood flows from the intestines to the liver before it goes to the rest of the body. And this is a good thing, because the liver contains all sorts of enzymes and to help break down foods and get those foods ready for the body. And it's also the main area where alcohol is dealt with. And the big one here is this enzyme here, alcohol dehydrogenase. And this enzyme here actually is responsible for about 80% of the metabolism of alcohol. So about 80%. There's another enzyme here, I can never remember what the name is. That's about 10%. And the other 10%, by the way, is your breath and urine. So this is why the police have those breathalyzers, because the amount of alcohol in your breath is correlated to the amount of alcohol in the blood, right? So it can be detected in the breath, and then they can make a judgment on whether they think you're intoxicated or not, kind of thing. So this is it, right? Your liver is there. This is where most of the alcohol is getting broken down, and we only have so much liver. So you can't speed up alcohol digestion. This is why it's recommended that you drink slowly. so that your liver has a chance to kind of, can only go so fast, right? That's kind of it. So you can't get alcohol out of the system by drinking coffee. You could be a sleepy drunk, or you could be a more awake drunk, but you're still drunk. Is kind of the way the police officers talk about it, right? Coffee is not going to help your liver speed up. The only thing to get the alcohol out of the system is time, because the liver, like I said, can only work so fast. There's only so much liver, and that's really part of it. And it's mostly alcohol dehydrogenase, which is kind of the big part of what is breaking down that alcohol. Now, the amount of alcohol dehydrogenase does depend on the person. We have some of it in the liver, some of it's actually found in the intestine. So, for example, chronic alcoholics tend to have more alcohol dehydrogenase in their liver, but less in their intestines. So what does that mean? It means that they're able to get drunk a little easier, but they're able to handle higher amounts of alcohol generally. But there's a whole bunch of variables, things like genetics, diet, even the microorganisms again in your body. And one of the other things to know is that women make way less than men. So something again to do with genetics. In terms of, I think I've got a slide here that shows, how much less or something like that. So just give me a second here. And of course, your dietary kind of condition. For example, if you're fasting, fasting or starvation causes degradation of the body, and these enzymes they vaporize. They're pretty much gone. They break down, and so people who are fasting or under starvation can get inebriated, intoxicated much easier and much quicker than a regular person. So, like I said, a lot of variables here, and you can't speed it up. Yeah. So here's some numbers, right, showing a man and a woman. And so I want to just point out, let's say 73 kilograms. It's about an average man. I'm going to also circle 73 kilograms for a woman. Average woman is of course not 73 kilograms, but just for comparison, so you can see that what was I going to say here? I can't remember what I was going to say about this. I'm really sorry. But these charts, if you look at them, you get an idea of where impairment begins. So I wanted to point out, for example, that 0.08% is the legal limit. So this is the kind of thing that if you get pulled over and you fail a breathalyzer test, it means you have a higher concentration than 0.08%. But that being said, you can see impairment can begin at lower concentrations, 0.02, 0.03%. You're starting to see some of the effects of alcohol. So I don't know why they decided 0.08% in terms of, probably has something to do with how fast your reflexes are or something like that. But you can see that that's what we're looking at. If you're under the graduate licensing system, of course, your blood alcohol level is supposed to be 0 at all times when you're driving. Here's just another kind of correlation between blood alcohol level and some of the brain responses. And so these are all things I talked about already, right? Muscle coordination, vision impaired, loss of consciousness, those kind of things. But a correlation between those kind of things anyway. Like I said, it's not perfect. Every body is a little different, but that's kind of the way it is. Like I said, the alcohol does affect a lot of body functions. It's worth talking a little bit about the liver, which is the main area where alcohol is metabolized. And it turns out that the liver will turn alcohol into fat. So kind of the story here, right? Everything that's consumed in excess gets turned into fat. And this can have an effect on liver, right? And so people who do drink quite a bit and over the long term, they start getting a fatty liver, it's called. You can see the normal healthy liver on the top and the fatty livers in the middle. And this is considered a stage of liver deterioration. And the extra fat will actually interfere with distribution of nutrients and oxygens in the liver. It can get worse where this is starting to something called cirrhosis, fibrosis is another stage sort of between fatty liver and cirrhosis. And this is where the liver is starting to get scarred. this is reversible at this point. You can reverse by stopping drinking, having good nutrition, that kind of thing. One of the stages is something called cirrhosis, where liver cells are starting to die and they harden, and they change color and those kind of things. And unfortunately, in this case here, a lot of that damage is irreversible, which is unfortunate. Like I said, alcohol is affecting all sorts of body systems. It does slow down amino acid metabolism, which actually inhibits the immune system. So people who are chronic alcoholics have weaker immune systems. It speeds up blood lipid synthesis because, of course, you're having extra lipids in there, and from the absorption of the alcohol, and so can lead to people gaining weight, particularly around the belly. And so you talk about people with beer bellies, and I'm not really sure why the fat accumulates there. Everybody seems to hate belly fat. Unfortunately, it seems to catch up with all of us at some point. Alcohol can also affect reproductive health as well. We'll talk about alcohol fetal syndrome, but in women, it can also lead to miscarriages and things like that as well in some cases. For men, you can Google sexual effects of alcohol, but I think it does affect. There is some erectile dysfunction and ejaculation dysfunction in some men. I'm not so familiar with the literature on that as well. And again, there's all sorts of other body functions that we could talk about, how it affects the brain. There's something called, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, Wernick Corsico syndrome. And I'm slightly familiar with it because I actually know somebody who had this. And the thing is, with chronic alcoholism, you're ending up with, in some cases, it's affecting your nutrient digestion, right, or your nutrient absorption. And this is where people, thiamine, which is vitamin B1, that's affected. And that's required for the brain. And so you can end up with irreversible damage to the brain, right? So think of all the effects on brain, things like confusion, memory loss, those kind of things. And some of it can be irreversible brain damage, unfortunately. And like I said, we could go on and on and on about all the different body systems, but we're not gonna do that. We only can talk about so much, and I'm sure you've heard enough about alcohol. Actually, my slides are a little bit out of order. I'll come back to this one in a second. So I just wanted to show you, in terms of the amount of calories in alcohol, to give you an idea. Alcohol has more calories than carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are 4, so alcohol is 7 grams or 7 calories per gram. Carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. Fat is about 9 calories per gram. So they can be fattening, and depending on what people have in there too, right? So, I'm not familiar with necessarily all of these drinks here, but of course, people do add mixes to their drinks, right? People will add, Coca-Cola or something like that, and so it can be even extra fattening depending on the mixes being added to their drinks as well. So people who drink 2 beer after supper every day, they could be adding an extra 300 or more calories to their diet very, very easily. This is just a chart. I think I like the graphic a little bit better. And I found this graphic here, which doesn't show the number of calories, but I do like the graphic because it shows the kind of the comparison, right? 1 beer is like about a full bag of popcorn. A pint of cider is about a pizza slice, and so on. And I'm not sure if this is correct. A margarita is equivalent to a plain bagel. A plain bagel can actually have quite a few calories in it. So I have to look up the exact numbers, but I do like these graphics. They make it very easy to understand. So it's worth it talking a little bit about a hangover for a minute or two. Hangover is the effect that people have often the next day, and it's kind of a bit of a withdrawal from alcohol. A big part of it is from having alcohol in the system, and also having things like dehydration and the other thing is there are a lot of chemicals that are byproducts of your breakdown of alcohol. So if you're consuming too much, your body breaks down alcohol into something called acetaldehyde. I can spell that out if you want. Acetaldehyde. I won't ask you about that on an exam, but that's a byproduct of the breakdown of alcohol. Before it gets broken down into other things, that's sort of an intermediate. And sometimes that acetaldehyde gets broken down into formaldehyde and methanol as sort of byproducts. And those are not good chemicals to have in your system. So they can cause all these things, nausea, headaches, those kind of things. So, there's about a bazillion cures for hangovers. Some of them you can buy at the stores and whatnot. But unfortunately, this is the big one, right? Those chemicals have to get out of the system. And so time, again, it's the liver, can only work so fast. People can try to treat the dehydration, and sometimes treating electrolytes and dehydration can be a big deal. In fact, for many people, that's a huge help. That's where their headache is coming from. But really the big one is time. So that's about it. So a couple of things here. Myths and truths about alcohol. Shot of alcohol warms you up. Kind of makes your skin feel warmer, but it actually cools the body. Wine and beer are mild and do not lead to addiction. Actually, you know what? Wine and beer, there's different wines and beers. In fact, they're the biggest consumed beverages, and they may be more mild, and maybe it's better to have a beer than a bunch of vodka. But they do lead to addictions, just like any other alcohol beverage. Mixing drinks is what gives you a hangover. No, it's the alcohol that gives you a hangover. Alcohol is a stimulant. Nope, presses the brain. Alcohol is legal and therefore it's not a drug. No, it actually is a drug and considered a toxin in many ways. It can be defined. Nutrition, I think I touched on a bunch of these things already, so I'm not going to dwell on them any further. You can see there's a few notes here about how it affects the absorption of and retention of certain types of vitamins and nutrients. So I'm not gonna dwell on that anymore. Probably some of that will come back in later units. And there's some graphics here if you want to take a look. And it's talking about all the different body systems in terms of short-term effects and long-term effects of drinking alcohol. Last thing I want to touch on is alcohol is actually a class 1 human carcinogen. This is the one that kind of blows a lot of people's minds. They're like, what? It's a carcinogen? Yes, actually, alcohol is associated with, I think, actually 8 types of cancer. And all of these are really well understood in heavy drinkers. Moderate drinkers, they're not well understood. But you can see that the bigger circles here are the better connections between these types of cancers. So breast cancer is the #1 cancer in women, and drinking can contribute to that. So something to think about. I think there's another infographic here that shows you, for at least mouth and cancer, what the risk is. So they're showing that if you don't drink any alcohol, of 1,000 people, about 5 will get mouth cancer. People who drink a little bit every week, I'm not sure what a unit is, so I have there defined on the right, 1 extra case. And then the heavy drinkers here on the bottom are getting a lot of extra cases of mouth cancer. So like I said, a lot of these are epidemiological studies that are showing connections. Breast cancer risk, you can see here, risk is about 116 women per 1,000 are going to get breast cancer in lifetime, and a few extra cases for people who are drinking up to 3 units a day. But when it gets to the heavier drinking, we're looking at a lot more cases, and that's where the biggest concern is. So I just want to finish off talking a little bit about red wine. The bad news is it is probably too good to be true. I know a lot of wine drinkers. I enjoy red wine myself from time to time. It certainly goes down with certain meals very well. And you'll hear people talk about, oh, it's good for me. A little bit is good for me. And there's tons of studies done on this kind of thing that suggest maybe, if you look at some of these cultures in France and the Mediterranean, and they sound to have slightly better, healthier lives. And these studies are saying it's the wine. But again, there's so many different variables when you're looking at these cultures. And here we're talking about what those phytochemicals, right? The flavonoids are in the wine, but probably there's probably not enough flavonoids in the wine to really give you the good effect. You can actually get better effects from just drinking grape juice because there's actually a higher amount of flavonoids in grape juice than there is in wine. And even more flavonoids if you eat the grapes because the flavonoids come from the skin. And so, you know, even better, right? But probably too good to be true. Like I said, lots of mixed science on this, and my best understanding is that it's probably too good to be true, unfortunately. Okay, so I thought I had, hold on a second. I'm done with that unit, but I did have, where did it go? Oh yes, there we go. Sorry about that. I just have a couple of reminders and then we're finished for today. Let me just pull this up here. Okay, some quick reminders. Quiz 2 is due today. So I haven't checked to see how many people have done it, but I think last time I checked it was quite a few. We just finished topic 3. So quiz 3, you'll have 1 week to complete. And another reminder is that the assignment 1 is due on Friday. So a couple of quick tips about your assignments as everyone's finishing them up. Do make sure you read the instructions on the assignment sheet, okay? There are specific instructions there, and some people are going to be losing marks because they are not going to be following the instructions to a T. I do want to make sure that you are following the instructions, that you have, for example, minimum of 5 facts, that your facts are factual enough. You're not just saying it's good for you or bad for you. That's not a fact. That's kind of just really wishy-washy, vague stuff. The other thing is if you're handing it in with a partner, just make sure both of your names are on it somewhere so that I can make sure that I am grading it, giving you both the same grade. You can both hand it in or one person can hand it in, it doesn't really matter. I'll probably figure it out once I get a chance to look at them. So yeah, if you have any questions, I've heard from a number of you about your infographics. I can always answer them over email or in an office hour. But that's it for today. Just those reminders, and we'll see everybody on Friday morning.